Why was she always invisible, even in the one place where every soldier's life passed through her hands? The fluorescent lights hummed above rows of rifles and pistols, their polished steel gleaming in sterile silence. To most soldiers, the armory was just a stop, a place to sign out a weapon before training or missions. But to Tours, it was a cathedral. Every barrel inspected, every firing pin checked, every serial number logged with a precision most overlooked. She moved quietly through the aisles, her hands steady, her eyes scanning. When others grumbled at paperwork, she found order in it. When others rushed, she lingered. Soldiers rotated in and out, barely noticing her, the clerk behind the counter, the background figure who made sure their rifles didn't jam when it mattered most. But they didn't know her, not really. Before the uniform, before the concrete walls of Fort, she had stood on open Texas fields, a skinny girl with arms, a rifle steady against her shoulder. Her father's voice guided her then, not soft, but steady, like the land itself. "You don't miss, Sam. You don't have that luxury." Missing meant hunger. Missing meant losing what you needed. He taught her to read the wind by the way grass bent, to wait for her heartbeat to slow before pulling a trigger, to treat patience as a weapon sharper than speed. By 12, she could drop a coyote before it touched the livestock. By 16, she was making shots most men twice her age bragged about but never attempted. Her father would have cuffed her ear if she'd ever boasted. It wasn't about glory. It was about necessity. That necessity had shaped her. And years later, when the ranch crumbled and college felt out of reach, the Army offered stability. Not a dream, not a calling, just a path. And when they placed her in the armory instead of a combat slot, she didn't fight it. She embraced it. Others sneered. They saw it as a dead end. She saw it as responsibility. Every weapon that crossed her counter carried lives on its barrel. Quiet diligence mattered more than adrenaline. Still, when the base went quiet after lights out, she sometimes felt the weight of being dismissed. The prideful sergeant boasting about his 700-yard shot never knew she once hit double that distance on a winter dawn, a hog dropping clean in a frozen field. She never corrected them. Silence earned more than pride. But silence came at a cost. Most nights she stayed late, lingering at the range when others went to the gym or the bar. She borrowed leftover rounds, any rifle left unchecked. No crowds, no bravado, just her, the paper targets, and the echo of rounds cracking across the dark. A range officer once asked if she'd considered sniper school. She deflected, "Not my lane, sir," but the thought lingered. Patience, that was her gift, that was her weapon. Hours waiting, adjusting a sight by fractions, letting time itself slow until the rifle felt like part of her bones. It wasn't flashy, it earned no medals, but it was hers. The day that changed everything began like any other. Rifles stacked, paperwork neat, the smell of CLP oil heavy in the air. Special Forces operators had just returned from the field, their boots muddy, their laughter loud. They dropped rifles on the counter like it was a bar top, too tired to care about protocol. Worked among them like a shadow, steady, efficient. Among them was Sergeant First Class Mark Daniels. He carried himself with the kind of ease that only came from surviving too much confident, the center of every room. His rifle was different. A long-range machine built for impossible shots, polished and worn at the same time. His eyes flicked to it as he set it down. The scope, the balance, the marks of thousands of rounds fired. She recognized its language without touching it. The men swapped stories, as they always did. Jokes about missed shots they'd never admit in reports, boasts about the ones they made. Daniels spoke of extreme ranges, laughing at how even seasoned snipers failed past 2,000 meters. Someone asked what the longest possible hit was. Daniels didn't hesitate. 3,800 meters. You can barely see that far, let alone hit. The others whistled, shaking their heads. Moved down the line, logging serials, her pen steady. She wasn't supposed to care, but something inside her bristled. She remembered that frosted Texas morning. The hog, the silence, the way distance stopped mattering when patience carried you. And before she knew it, the words slipped out, a whisper, a thought not meant for ears. "That's not impossible." The room stilled. Daniels turned. "What's that, Tors?" Heat rushed to her face, but her voice stayed calm. "I said it's not impossible, just unlikely." The room erupted in laughter. Soldiers elbowed each other, grinning. An armory clerk questioning physics itself. Daniels smirked, eyes narrowing, studying her like a puzzle. "Unlikely, huh? You ever shot past 2 miles, specialist?" "No," her voice was even, "but long shots don't scare me." The laughter grew louder. Daniels leaned forward, grinning like a wolf. "Tell you what, bet you can't even scratch steel at 3,800. You up for it?" She looked at him, then at the rifle resting between them. She didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. Her silence stretched long enough to change the air. The chuckles quieted, eyes turned. The room tilted, waiting. Her father's voice drifted back, rough and true. "Never say you can until you've tried." "If the rifle's good enough," she said softly, "I'll take the shot." The room exploded. Laughter, disbelief, the kind of sound soldiers make when they think they've just witnessed someone step too far out of line. Some clapped their buddies on the back, shaking heads. Others frowned, uncomfortable. Daniels didn't laugh. His grin only widened. "Is that so? You hiding a sniper's badge back there?" "No, Sergeant, but I know how to shoot." The challenge hung heavy. His voice dropped, savoring it. 7 days, we'll take you to the long-range pit. 3,800 meters, you hit, I buy the unit stake. You miss, you clean every rifle we own. Deal. Every eye turned. Wrote another serial number into the logbook, hand steady. Then she looked up, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Fine, but I'll need your rifle." That stopped him, just for a beat. Then the grin returned, sharp. "My rifle, huh? You think you can just pick up a .416 and ring steel at 2 miles? If it's your bet, it should be your rifle." Silence, then a slap of his palm on the counter. "Deal." The room roared. By nightfall, the whispers spread like wildfire. The armory clerk versus the sniper. Some laughed, saying she'd been set up. Others her. But a quiet current of curiosity wound through the base. Said nothing. She didn't brag, she didn't deny. She followed her rhythm, rifles logged, bolts checked, paperwork neat, but now eyes followed her. Smirks, side glances, whispered jokes. That night in her bunk, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her chest tight with humility and something else, something restless. She hadn't meant to speak. The words had slipped out from the part of her that hated being underestimated. And now she was trapped. She thought of the target, a speck at the horizon. She thought of wind, of bullet drop, of luck swallowing even the best. Could she do it? Almost certainly not. But a voice deep inside whispered that wasn't the point. The point was standing when someone said you couldn't. 3 days later, Daniels leaned against her counter again, his rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes bright with mischief. "Still in, Tors. Haven't lost your nerve." She kept her hands moving, attaching inspection tags. "Still in." "Good," he chuckled. "The boys are looking forward to the show." She didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she asked, "You ever zero your rifle at that range?" He blinked, then laughed. "Zero at 3,800. You don't zero that far, you adjust, dial your scope, pray to whatever God you believe in." She nodded slowly, filing it away. That night she walked the quiet length of the range, no rifle in her hands. The ground glittered with brass, the air heavy with the smell of powder. She knelt at the firing line, staring at the dark. 800 yards to the berm, but in her mind she stretched it. She breathed slow, steady, matching her heartbeat to the earth. She imagined the recoil, the silence after the shot, the metallic ring that might never come. Her hands didn't shake. That surprised her. Instead, there was calm, the same calm from Texas nights, the calm before the shot that mattered. And as dawn neared, she knew one truth. Whether she hit or missed, she would not walk away silent. Why did the thought of failure feel heavier than the recoil itself? The whispers had spread faster than any bulletin. By the second day, even cooks in the mess hall knew about the bet. The Armory Clerk, 3,800 meters, Daniel's rifle. It rolled across Fort like wildfire, changing shape each time it was told. Some laughed, some her. Some muttered she'd never even touched dirt. Others began to wonder. Moved through the noise like a shadow. She didn't correct the rumors, didn't fuel them. She kept her rhythm, bolts inspected, rifles logged, paperwork neat, but every step carried weight now. Soldiers lingered longer at the counter. Some smirked. Some offered quiet nods as though they wanted to believe she could prove them wrong, but no one said it out loud. At night, she lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling. The tension hummed in her chest, not fear exactly, but something close. Not of losing, she'd almost certainly miss. What rattled her was being seen, being noticed for the first time. The anonymity she'd lived in was gone, and she wasn't sure if she wanted it back. Her roommate, a logistics specialist who talked too much, noticed her silence. "You're awfully quiet," she teased. "Nervous about the circus." Forced a smile, something like that. She didn't explain, she never did. The next morning, she checked out a rifle from the range. Not the .416 she'd be handed on the 7th day, but the closest she could get without raising eyebrows, an M2010. She lay prone on the mat, cheek pressed against the stock, the air cool with morning. The first round cracked downrange, too high. The second too low. She adjusted, exhaled, squeezed. Slowly the rhythm came back. Breath, trigger, impact. Her groups tightened. Not enough for 2 miles, not even close, but enough to remind her body of the old conversations she used to have with rifles in Texas. Other soldiers walked past, muttering. Some pointed, some laughed under their breath. The armory girl thinks she's a sniper. She ignored them. She wasn't chasing their approval. She was listening to the wind, to the shift of dust across asphalt, to the way her shoulder tensed and released with recoil. Hours slipped by until her arms ached and her shoulder bruised, but the doubts inside her had shifted too. They no longer felt like anchors. They felt like sparks. Meanwhile, Daniels was enjoying himself. Word reached her through hushed voices in the chow hall. He'd been seen retelling the story with that wolfish grin. "She doesn't stand a chance," he'd laugh. "I've seen trained snipers choke on that pit, and she thinks she's going to walk in from the armory and do what most can't, please." But not everyone agreed with him. A private muttered, "You ever actually watch her at the range? She doesn't miss." A sergeant shook his head. "Different, doesn't talk, just does it." It was strange. The base was splitting. Some waited for her to fail. Others quietly hoped she wouldn't. On the 4th night, unable to sleep, pulled out an old leather-bound notebook. She hadn't opened it in years. Inside were faded sketches of bullets, scribbled charts, wind notes she'd from magazines, and lines written in her father's rough hand. "A shot is a conversation between you and the world, Sam. You don't force it. You listen." Her throat tightened. He died before he could ever see her in uniform, but his voice lingered in those pages. She traced the ink with her fingers and allowed herself, for the first time, to imagine not only failing but succeeding. Could she? Could she actually? The week wore on. She practiced without fanfare. She studied wind, not just on the range, but in trees, in flags, in the swirl of dust across asphalt. She practiced her breathing in her bunk, lying flat, timing her chest to an invisible trigger. By the 6th day, she found herself steady, not arrogant, but calm. A kind of peace. That evening, Daniels walked into the armory. He placed the case on her counter with a casual thud, opening it like a priest revealing a relic. The rifle gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights, long and heavy, scope mounted like an eye that could see across time itself. "That's the tool you'll be working with tomorrow," he said. "Kicks harder than what you're used to, scopes dialed, triggers heavy but smooth. Think you can handle her?" Met his gaze. "I'll try." Daniels smirked, though for the first time something like seriousness edged his tone. "Try won't cut it. That range eats people alive. Don't embarrass yourself." She didn't reply. She signed the temporary log, handed the case back, and turned back to her work. Daniel studied her, head tilted, then laughed softly. "You're something else, Tors, brave or crazy, can't tell which." That night barely slept. The hum of voices in the barracks carried down the hall, soldiers buzzing with anticipation. Tomorrow the circus would gather. Tomorrow they'd all watch. She closed her eyes, whispering the words her father had drilled into her bones. "Listen, don't force it." The morning broke crisp and blue. The sky stretched endless above Fort as soldiers drifted toward the long-range pit in groups. It wasn't every day a clerk challenged a sniper, or maybe, more accurately, was baited into one. The story had grown in retelling. Some swore she'd bragged about impossible shots. Others claimed Daniels had pushed her until she snapped. Whatever the truth, the stage was set. From her barracks window watched the first trucks roll past. She laced her boots with quiet precision. No gear, no rifle, just her water bottle and silence. As she walked, soldiers stared. Some smirked, some raised brows. A few muttered encouragement so low she might have missed it if not for her sharp ears. She gave no answer, boots striking pavement in steady rhythm, eyes forward. The pit sprawled wide under the rising sun, heat waves already shimmering above sand and scrub. At the horizon, barely visible without optics, a pale speck of steel waited. A crowd of 50 had gathered. Soldiers perched on tailgates, leaning on Humvees, placing side bets. The air buzzed with energy, like a fight night, like a stadium before the game. At the center, Sergeant First Class Daniels stood beside a folding table. His rested there, long barrel catching sunlight, scope glinting. He spotted her instantly and grinned. "Look who showed. Thought you might lost your nerve, Tors." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Didn't flinch. She walked straight to the table, eyes on the rifle. "I said I'd try." Daniels lifted the lid the rest of the way with a flourish as though crowning the jewel. "Zeroed at 1,000. Past that. You're on your own. She'll buck hard. Don't cry about the recoil. You ready?" She didn't answer. Instead, she ran her hand along the stock, testing its balance the way her father had taught her. "Feel the rifle before you trust it." Daniels raised an eyebrow, smirk still on his face, but his eyes betrayed the faintest flicker of curiosity. The crowd pressed closer. A soldier muttered, "She looks like she's never even held one." Another scoffed, "Wait till she cracks." Ignored them. She knelt, settling prone behind the rifle, cheek against the stock. The world hushed. The crowd faded until all she could hear was her breath and the faint rustle of grass. Her father's voice whispered again, "Treat it like an old friend, Sam. Don't fight it. Listen." She adjusted the bipod, straightened her spine, aligned her shoulders, looked through the scope, and the earth stretched forever. Heat shimmer blurred the horizon. The target was no more than a blur. Doubt punched through her. "Too far, too insane, you don't belong here." Then she inhaled, slow and deep. Let it drift away. Belonging wasn't the point, trying was. Daniels crouched beside her, speaking loud enough for all to hear. "All right, Tors, safety, off, 10 rounds. Let's see if you can even touch dirt near that plate." The crowd chuckled, closed her eyes briefly, felt the earth under her chest, the press of the rifle into her shoulder, the rhythm of her heart. She remembered the frost crunching beneath her belly in Texas, waiting for a hog to step clear. The stillness, the patience. Her eyes opened, sharp and calm. She wrapped her hand around the grip, finger resting near the trigger. Not Daniels, not the crowd, not even the distance. Just her and the conversation waiting between bullet and wind. The world leaned closer. Tors prepared to fire the first shot that no one would ever forget. What would silence feel like if it carried the weight of every soldier's expectation? The world held its breath as lay prone, cheek pressed to the stock of Daniels, eyes locked on the blur of steel almost 2.5 miles away. The rifle's weight pressed into her shoulder, heavy, alive. Around her, the crowd leaned closer, the air buzzing with anticipation. eager to witness failure. She drew in one long breath, exhaled, steadied, and squeezed. The recoil slammed into her shoulder like a hammer, rocking her back into the mat. She gritted her teeth, stayed focused, tried to track the bullet's trace through the scope. Then nothing. No dust, no ping, just silence. Laughter broke the air like glass. Soldiers bent over, clutching their knees. One shouted, didn't even hit dirt. Another doubled over, tears in his eyes. Daniels chuckled, his voice loud enough to ride over the chaos. 100 yards short, 50 wide. Don't worry, Tors, happens to the best of us. Well, he smirked. The rest of us. The laughter surged. Didn't answer. She adjusted. Tiny movements, careful dials on the scope. She wasn't hearing their jeers. She was hearing data, the way the shot had fallen short, the way the wind had pushed. Her father's voice stirred again. You're not just shooting at the target, Sam. You're shooting through everything between you and it. She chambered the second round. The roared again. Dust erupted closer to the plate, though still wide. The laughter softened into murmurs, a ripple of surprise. She was adjusting, learning. Daniels crouched, lowering his spotting scope. The grin wavered just slightly. Better, but the wind's not your friend today. You gotta feel it. He tapped his temple. It's not just math, it's instinct. She didn't look at him, she didn't speak. She chambered the third round. The thunder echoed, another plume of dust closer. The crowd hushed. The smirks began to fade, replaced by something else, curiosity. Walking it in, Daniels muttered almost to himself, but his smirk didn't reach his eyes now. The fourth shot rang out. The crowd leaned forward. The round struck close again, close enough that men who'd been laughing minutes ago now shaded their eyes, as though squinting would help them see better. By the fifth round, the laughter was gone. The long silence between thunder and impact stretched the air taut, every soldier holding their breath, waiting. Dust rose just feet from the steel plate. Gasps replaced jeers. She almost hit it, someone whispered. Daniel's jaw tightened. He forced a grin, but his spotting scope trembled ever so slightly in his hands. Ignored them all. Her shoulder ached, this recoil punishing, but the pain steadied her, reminded her she was still in control. Her breathing slowed. Her movements became smaller, sharper. She wasn't calculating ballistic charts or spitting numbers. She was reading the world itself, the shimmer of heat waves, the way the grass bent in the breeze, the dust curling across sand. The sixth shot cracked through the silence. Time stretched. Then a puff of dirt exploded inches from the steel plate. The crowd gasped in unison. She almost hit it, another soldier muttered, this time not in disbelief but in awe. Daniel's grin faltered. He lowered the spotting scope, his jaw tight. Close doesn't count, Tors, steel or nothing. She didn't answer. She chambered the seventh round, adjusting one last fraction. Her heart slowed. Her father's voice whispered, listen, don't force it. The roared. Silence followed, stretching long, heavy. Soldiers leaned forward, squinting, breath caught in their throats. Then it came. Clang. The sound rolled back across the pit like thunder, sharp, undeniable, echoing through the crowd. The steel had rung. The pit erupted, gasps, shouts, disbelief. No way. She hit it. Holy hell, she nailed it. Daniels pulled back from his scope, blinking. For a heartbeat, his face was bare, surprise, sharp and raw before he forced the crooked grin back. One hit doesn't make a sniper, Tors. Do it again. She ignored him, chambered the next round. The eighth shot cracked. The kicked hard. The crowd leaned forward, squinting into the horizon. Clang. The steel rang again, louder this time, clear. The pit exploded. Soldiers shouted, clapped, swore. All replaced disbelief. Reverence replaced laughter. She did it again. No damn way. Daniel's grin was gone. His jaw flexed as he leaned into the scope. His voice didn't carry this time. He didn't need to, his silence told the truth. Remained calm. No smile, no gloat, just chambered another round. The ninth shot cracked. Dust erupted just off the plate's edge. Inches. The crowd groaned, some jeering weakly, but their voices carried no conviction. They had already seen too much. Daniels exhaled, the tension in his voice softer now. Close. Her face stayed still, eyes sharp. She chambered the 10th and final round. Sweat slid down her temple. The crowd leaned closer. She inhaled, exhaled, let her heart beat slow. The roared one last time. The silence stretched thin as wire. Soldiers shielded their eyes, hearts pounding. Then clang. The steel rang for the third time. The pit erupted. Soldiers shouted, some tossing caps into the air, some pounding each other on the back. Their disbelief turned into something louder, something raw. Awe. 3 hits at 3,800 meters from an armory clerk. Lowered the rifle gently, engaged the safety, cleared the chamber and rested it on the table. She rose slowly, her body sore, her uniform dirt-streaked, but her eyes calm, unshaken. The crowd surged, soldiers clapping her back, shaking their heads in wonder. "How the hell did you do that?" one asked, wide-eyed. "Luck," another muttered, but his voice carried no strength. Daniels finally stepped forward, raising his hand. His voice carried, steady but heavier than before. "All right, enough. Show over." Groans rose, but soldiers dispersed slowly, still buzzing, still whispering. They weren't going to forget. Brushed dirt from her sleeves, movements calm. She looked at Daniels, her voice low but clear. "You said I couldn't do it." Daniels studied her for a long moment, his mask slipping. His voice was quieter now. "You surprised me, Tors. Not many can say that." She gave a single nod. No smile, no victory pose, just quiet dignity. She turned, lifted her canteen, and walked away. Behind her, whispers swirled, disbelief settling into memory, memory turning into legend. She hadn't just hit steel. She cracked something deeper. The barrier between the invisible and the undeniable, between what soldiers assumed and what she had proven. And though the challenge was over, everyone who had watched knew the truth as they followed her figure retreating into the distance. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. What happens when the shot is over, but the echo refuses to fade? The pit had fallen silent once walked away, but only on the surface. Beneath, energy rippled like electricity across wires. Soldiers huddled in groups, whispering, replaying the clang of steel as though they needed to convince themselves it had really happened. Some mimicked her prone position, laughing in disbelief. Others swore they could still hear the ringing of the target in their bones. 3 hits at 3,800, one muttered, shaking his head. "She's not even a sniper," another replied. "Hell," someone else said, half under his breath, "maybe she is now." Laughter no longer mocked. It carried awe, disbelief, reverence. Daniels lingered at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, his eyes following her quiet figure as she stepped into the shade beyond the range. Every instinct in him wanted to shrug it off, to dismiss her success as luck. But deep in his chest, something twisted, a knot of recognition. He'd seen arrogance crumble soldiers before. He'd seen men and women lose their edge the moment they were tested. But she had stood steady, taken the ridicule and carved through it without flinching. 3 hits at 2 miles. Not luck, something more. The soldiers pressed him as the crowd began to thin. "So, Sergeant, you paying up?" one joked, grinning. Daniel's eyes flicked toward them, sharp enough to silence the laughter. "It wasn't about stake," he said flatly. Another private asked, "Then what was it?" Daniels didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted back to where sat on a crate, sipping water. She wasn't smiling, wasn't celebrating. She looked like someone cooling down after a run, not someone who had just shaken the foundation of the base. Finally, Daniels exhaled. "I told her she couldn't, and she did." The soldiers erupted in laughter, slapping shoulders, jeering not at him, but at the absurdity of the moment. By evening, the chow hall buzzed. Soldiers leaned across tables, retelling the story to anyone who hadn't been there. "You should seen it," one corporal said, wide-eyed. "Seventh shot, clang, just like that. She did it again, then a third time like it was nothing." "No way," a private scoffed. "Ask anyone who was there. Daniels himself had to eat it." The tale grew with every retelling. By the third version had hit 5 in a row. By the fourth, she'd made the shots blindfolded. Exaggerations didn't matter. What mattered was the myth taking shape. Tors, the armory girl, had humbled a sniper at his own line. She felt the shift the next morning. Walking through the moat or pool, soldiers who once passed without a glance now nodded in greeting. Some even saluted. Others clapped her shoulder, grinning. "Hell of a shot, Tors." She gave small nods in return, never lingering. She wasn't chasing their admiration, but she couldn't deny the flicker of warmth in her chest. Inside the armory, her rhythm didn't change. Rifles cleaned with meticulous care, bolts checked, paperwork logged, but she noticed the eyes. Soldiers lingered longer, pretending to need something just to watch her work. Whispers carried through the doorway, the soldier who'd done the impossible. Daniels, for his part, kept his distance. When their paths crossed, there was no smirk, no jab, just a curt nod, a silence that something had shifted. And though never sought it, respect spread like wildfire. What had begun as mockery had become something larger, a legend neither Daniels nor could control. By the end of the week, the shot had traveled farther than the bullet ever could. Across barracks and chow lines, whispered in late-night guard shifts, repeated during pre-mission briefings. "She hit it 2 miles, ask anyone." The details blurred. Some swore she had called her shots before squeezing the trigger. Others claimed Daniels had sweated beside her, rattled, but the core remained. She had been challenged and she had answered. Herself carried on as always, unlocking the armory at dawn, logging equipment with steady hands, scrubbing grease until rifles gleamed. But the way people looked at her was different now. Young privates approached her, nervous before rifle qualifications. "Specialist Tors, you think I can pass?" Her answer was always simple, steady. "Don't let someone else decide what you can't do." She never preached, never basked. She just reminded them quietly of what she had reminded herself. Daniels avoided the rumors. He didn't correct them, didn't feed them, but he didn't try to bury them either. Something inside him had shifted the moment the steel rang the second time. One evening, as the sky bled orange across Fort, he found her cleaning rifles outside the armory. They leaned against the wall beside her, already spotless. "You could let them celebrate you," he said. She looked up, arching a brow. "Why?" "Because most would cashed in, built themselves a reputation, maybe a slot on the sniper line. Wiped a bolt carrier, setting it aside. Reputation doesn't keep rifles clean, and I don't want to be on the sniper line. I just wanted to show that I could." Daniel studied her for a moment, then gave a short nod. "Fair enough. But if you ever change your mind, there's a place for someone like you. People with instincts like that don't come often." She shook her head. "Instinct doesn't make me a sniper, you know that. What I did was luck, rhythm, nothing more." Daniel smirked faintly. "Luck doesn't stack 3 hits at 3,800. He walked away, leaving her with the hum of twilight and the weight of his words. Weeks passed. The legend didn't fade. If anything, it grew louder. New arrivals to the base heard it before they unpacked. It became a campfire story, passed like a torch. "You know Tors, the armory specialist. She hit steel at 2 miles. Ask anyone." Some didn't believe it until they saw her, quiet, unassuming. The last person they expected to be the center of such a tale. That only made it stronger. At night, soldiers drifted to the long-range pit, staring at the speck of steel barely visible against the horizon. They'd shake their heads, murmuring about how impossible it looked. Then they'd say her name again, Tors, like a legend they couldn't quite let go. For the weight of it was strange. She had never set out to be anything more than steady, dependable. But now soldiers sought her not for gossip, but for reassurance. And though she deflected the praise, deep inside she carried a quiet truth. She had limits, not the physics of distance, but the boundaries others drew around her. One afternoon, weeks after the shot, she returned to the pit, not with a rifle. She had refused every offer to repeat the feat, just herself standing at the line, staring across the distance. The wind tugged at her sleeves. Heat shimmer danced. She imagined the bullet's long journey, the silence between thunder and clang. Behind her, Daniel stepped up. He didn't speak at first, just stood beside her, staring at the horizon. Finally, his voice broke the quiet. Funny thing about legends, they always start with someone who wasn't supposed to. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed on the speck of steel. Then she said, calm as ever, legends aren't the point. Doing it once was enough. I don't need more than that. Daniels chuckled low, genuine this time. That's why it stuck. That's why they'll keep telling it. And they did. Long after dust settled, long after the echoes faded, the story of tours rippled through the ranks, retold in training camps to motivate recruits, whispered overseas to spark courage before missions. Some versions grew outrageous, some were stripped bare, but the heart remained. She was only in the armory, until a sniper bet she couldn't. And she proved she could. What happens when the silence you once lived in is gone, and every hallway carries your name? By the 5th week, tours could no longer slip through fort unnoticed. She still wore the same uniform, still carried the same clipboard through the same armory, but now her shadow seemed heavier, stretched by the whispers that followed her wherever she went. The story was everywhere. She heard it in the mess hall, muttered between bites of food. She heard it in the gym, woven into the clank of iron plates. She even heard it outside her own barracks door, late at night, when soldiers laughed in disbelief at the idea of a clerk hitting steel where trained snipers had missed. At first she tried to bury herself in her routine. Rifles in, rifles out, serial numbers, bolts checked. The same rhythm that had once kept her invisible. But invisibility was gone now, replaced by glances that lingered, nods of respect, sometimes even hesitant salutes from soldiers who outranked her but had been shaken by the clang of steel that day. It was strange, the way myth worked. The facts no longer mattered. Some soldiers swore she had hit 5 times out of 10. Others claimed Daniels himself had admitted defeat publicly, bowing his head. The story grew taller with each retelling, until even barely recognized the version of herself people spoke of. But the younger soldiers believed. One afternoon, a private barely out of basic training walked into the armory, rifle slung awkwardly over his shoulder, eyes wide with nerves. "Specialist tours?" he asked, voice cracking. She looked up from the logbook. "Yes." He swallowed hard. "I've got rifle tomorrow. I'm not sure I'll pass. They said maybe you could." His words stumbled, embarrassed, but his eyes begged. Studied him for a moment. He reminded her of herself at that age, quiet, unsure, carrying doubt like it was part of the uniform. She set her pen down. "What's your biggest problem?" "My breathing," he admitted. "I rush, I panic." She nodded slowly. "Then don't think about the target, think about your lungs. Inhale, exhale, pause. The trigger breaks in that pause, not before, not after." The boy listened as if she'd handed him a secret map. He straightened, nodded, and left with a spark of something steadier in his chest. That night thought about him, about how he had looked at her, not like she was invisible, but like she was proof of something. Proof that being underestimated wasn't the same as being incapable. It unsettled her. She had never asked to be a symbol. Meanwhile, Daniel stayed quiet. He didn't join the rumors, didn't stoke the fire, but he didn't extinguish it either. When soldiers nudged him, asking for details, he gave only short answers. "She hit, that's all." But inside, the storm still churned. He replayed it in his head sometimes. The way she'd absorbed the ridicule without flinching, the way her patience had cut through physics and laughter alike. 3 hits at 3,800. He wanted to dismiss it, to call it luck, but something in his gut refused to let it go. He'd spent years building his reputation on the rifle, years perfecting shots at distances where most gave up. And yet, in one afternoon, she had cracked something inside him, not by stealing his skill, but by revealing something he had forgotten, the quiet power of patience. And it burned. Not with anger, with respect, the kind that felt like swallowing glass when pride resisted. One evening, as the sun sank low, Daniels found her outside the armory again. She was cleaning rifles, sleeves rolled, her movements calm and deliberate. They leaned against the wall beside her, spotless, polished, a weapon she had treated with the same care she gave every other. "You never fired it again," Daniels said. Looked up briefly, then back at her work. "Didn't need to." He leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. Most would, just to prove it wasn't luck. She slid a cleaned bolt into place, the sound crisp in the quiet. Proving it again doesn't change the first time. It doesn't matter how many times I try. It matters that once was enough. Daniels studied her. He wanted to argue, to press, but her words landed heavier than the rifle itself. Once was enough. For the first time since the bet, he allowed himself a small smile, not the wolfish grin, but something quieter. "You ever think maybe you've got more in you than this armory?" Paused, looked at him, then shook her head. "I'm not chasing more. Stability brought me here, not glory." Daniels nodded slowly, though something in his eyes lingered. Respect, curiosity, maybe even regret for how quickly he had dismissed her. The days stretched into weeks, and the legend only grew. New recruits heard it before they learned their way around the base. It became a test of belief. Did you hear about tours? Did you believe it? Could you imagine it? And through it all kept her head down, her movements steady, her silence intact. But silence was no longer simple. At night, in the stillness of the barracks, she lay awake, listening to whispers of her own name. She wondered what it meant to carry that weight, to have others place hope in her story, to have them look at her not as invisible but as proof. It was pride, but it was also a burden, because myths are hungry things. They demand more, and she feared she could not give it. One evening, sitting at the edge of her bunk, she opened her father's old notebook again. The faded ink, the careful notes, the words he had left her. "A shot is a conversation between you and the world. You don't force it, you listen." She traced the lines with her finger, and for the first time she realized the truth. That day at the pit hadn't been about the crowd, or Daniels, or even the steel ringing in the distance. It had been about listening, about refusing to let someone else decide her limits. The myth didn't matter. The story didn't matter. What mattered was the stillness inside her when she took the shot, the knowledge that she had been steady enough, patient enough, true enough, when the world told her she couldn't. And maybe that was enough. But she also knew something else. Legends once born rarely stayed silent. What happens when the weight of other people's belief presses heavier than the rifle ever did? The story had grown teeth. By the 6th week, Tours no longer just carried her clipboard and pen. She carried the expectations of an entire base. Soldiers she'd never spoken to sought her out. Some wanted advice. Some wanted to touch the rifle she'd used, as if the steel carried a trace of her willpower. Others just wanted to say they met her. It unnerved her. In the chow hall, conversation stilled when she walked in. At the gym, eyes followed her between sets. At the armory, soldiers lingered under flimsy excuses, watching her as though waiting for her to perform another impossible act. She'd never asked for it, she'd never wanted it. She had been content in silence, in invisibility, but silence had been stolen from her. And with every nod of respect, every whispered retelling, the burden grew heavier. It wasn't that she didn't feel pride. She did. Deep in her chest, a quiet warmth remained when she remembered the clang of steel, the stunned faces, Daniel's forced grin cracking into respect. But pride and pressure were twin weights, and one was far harder to carry. The myth was bigger than the truth now. Some swore she had called her shots, predicting impact before the bullet ever touched. Others claimed she had stood up after the third hit and saluted Daniels, daring him to take the rifle back. None of it was real. None of it belonged to her. And yet the soldiers believed. One evening, a group of young privates cornered her outside the armory. Their voices carried nervous awe. "Specialist tours, ma'am, how do you do it? How do you calm yourself? I freeze during." "Yeah," another muttered, "I can't even hit the target at 500. And you hit at 2 miles." Felt the weight of their eyes. She wanted to tell them the truth, that fear still lived in her chest, that her hands had shaken after the 10th shot, that she had walked back to her bunk that night certain she'd been lucky. But the words stuck. Instead, she said softly, "Don't think about the crowd. Don't think about failing. Focus on the breath. One pause, one squeeze, nothing else." The privates nodded, reverent, as though she'd handed them scripture. When they left, she sat on the crate outside the armory and stared at the fatting sun. She felt her father's notebook heavy in her pocket. The truth pressed harder than ever. She was becoming something she hadn't chosen. A symbol. And symbols are never left alone. Meanwhile, Daniels wrestled with his own silence. He watched from the edges as the legend spiraled. He heard the stories grow, saw soldiers treat her with a reverence once reserved for men with chestfuls of ribbons. He should have felt pride for sparking it. Instead, he felt something closer to unease. Because Daniels knew the truth. He had been at her shoulder when she fired. He had seen the way her eyes had narrowed, calm, patient, reading wind the way others read words. That hadn't been luck. That hadn't been myth. That had been instinct and discipline sharpened over years no one else had seen. And he respected it, but respect was dangerous. Special forces thrived on hierarchy, on proving dominance, on testing the weak until they broke. Yet here was a clerk, a woman most had dismissed, who had not only endured the test, but changed the men around her with nothing more than patience and silence. It rattled him more than he admitted. One evening, unable to shake it, Daniels sought her out. He found her sitting alone at the long-range pit, the horizon stretched before her, the steel target barely visible. She wasn't holding a rifle, just sitting, watching. "You come out here often?" he asked. She didn't turn. "Sometimes." "Why? No rifle, no training, just empty space." Her voice was quiet, "Because it reminds me what it cost." Daniels frowned, stepping closer. "Cost? You won the bet, tours, you proved them wrong." Her eyes stayed on the horizon. "I didn't win anything, I just lost the silence." The words hit him harder than he expected. He sank onto the dirt beside her, resting his arms on his knees. For a while, neither spoke. The wind whispered across the pit, tugging at their sleeves, carrying the faint echo of a clang that still seemed to live in the air. Finally, Daniels said, "You know, most people would give anything for what you've got now. Respect, recognition. Hell, you're a story they'll tell for years." Turned to him then, her eyes steady. "And what happens when they expect me to do it again? What happens when they stop seeing me as a soldier and start seeing me only as that story? What happens when I can't live up to their myth?" Daniels opened his mouth, then closed it, because he didn't have an answer. For all his years of training, all his combat, all his pride, he realized he had never carried the kind of weight she was carrying now. He'd chosen his reputation, built it, owned it. She had it forced on her, and that difference mattered. The silence stretched again. Finally, Daniels spoke, softer this time. "You surprised me, Tors, not just on the range, but here. Most people break when they're seen. You haven't." Looked back at the horizon. "Not yet." Daniels studied her profile, the way the fatting light caught in her eyes. For the first time, he felt something shift deep inside. Respect, yes, but also humility, maybe even something like guilt for how quickly he had mocked her. The days blurred forward, and the legend spread beyond Fort. Soldiers deploying overseas whispered the story to each other in tents, in armored convoys, in distant outposts where fear needed an antidote. You heard about Tor's, Armory Clerk, hit at 2 miles, doesn't brag, just did it. It became a rallying cry, proof that limits could be broken, proof that silence could ring louder than pride. And yet with each retelling felt the burden grow, because every time her name was spoken it wasn't her they were honoring, it was the myth, the symbol, the woman who had physics. But she wasn't a myth. She was a soldier with calloused hands, bruised shoulders, and quiet doubts that still whispered at night. And she wondered how long she could carry the story before it crushed her. How do you live with a legend that grows louder than your own voice? By the 7th week, Tors could feel the shift at every step. It wasn't just whispers now, it was requests, demands, invitations she had never asked for. A captain from another company stopped her outside the motor pool. "Specialist Tors, heard about your shot. We've got some new recruits. Be good for morale if you showed them what's possible. You know, fire a few rounds. Inspire 'em." Froze. She wanted to say no, to remind him she wasn't a sniper, wasn't a showpiece for the range. But his eyes held expectation, the weight of authority cloaked in casual suggestion. "I'll think about it, sir," she said quietly and walked away. But it didn't stop. Another day, a sergeant approached her in the chow line. "Tors, my guys are heading out next week. They'd like you to come talk to them. Maybe give them some of that calm you've got. The way you lined up those shots, hell, it'd do 'em good." She nodded politely, but her chest tightened. She didn't want to be a mascot. She didn't want to be a myth told to motivate others. She only wanted to keep her rhythm, rifles cleaned, bolts checked, her silence intact. But silence was gone. And the more people asked, the heavier it pressed. At night, she sat with her father's notebook open on her lap, the fatting words blurred under the dim light. "A shot is a conversation between you and the world. You don't force it. You listen." She whispered the words aloud as if reminding herself. She hadn't forced it that day. She had listened. And somehow the world had answered. But what they wanted from her now wasn't listening. It was performance. She feared what would happen if she gave in. Daniel saw it happening. He noticed the way soldiers swarmed her in the chow hall, the way commanders leaned on her presence in briefings she had no business being in, the way she walked with her head slightly lower now, as though trying to shrink back into invisibility. One evening he found her again at the pit. She stood at the line, hands empty, staring at the distant steel. "You're out here a lot," he said. She didn't turn. "It's quieter here." He studied her for a moment, then said, "They're going to keep pushing, asking more. They'll want you to prove it again." Her jaw tightened. "And if I do?" "Then the myth eats itself," Daniels shrugged. "They'll say you got lucky, that it was a fluke, that you're hiding." "Maybe I am hiding." He shook his head. "No, hiding would been backing down when I made the bet. Hiding would been laughing it off, staying invisible. You didn't do that. You stood up." She finally turned, eyes steady. "And now I'm trapped by it." For a moment he didn't know what to say, because she was right. The legend was no longer hers to control. It belonged to the soldiers who needed it, to the commanders who used it, to the whispers that carried across deployments. But he also knew something she hadn't realized yet. "Tors," he said slowly, "you don't get to choose whether they tell your story, but you do get to choose how you carry it, whether it crushes you or whether it reminds them of what silence can do." Her eyes narrowed, searching his face. For the first time his words weren't edged with pride or mockery. They carried respect, hard-earned, heavy. She looked back at the horizon. "I never wanted this." "Most who deserve it don't," he said quietly. The weeks rolled on, resisted every formal request to fire again. She deflected invitations to speak, declined offers to transfer to sniper school. But the myth didn't fade. If anything, her refusal only fed it. "She doesn't want glory," soldiers whispered. "That's what makes it real. She won't do it again because she doesn't need to. She already proved it." It twisted, turned, grew beyond her control. Some painted her as fearless, others as stubborn. None of them knew the truth, that every night she lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if her silence was cowardice or courage. Daniels noticed the strain. He saw the shadows under her eyes, the way her hands lingered a little longer on each rifle she cleaned, as if grounding herself in something real. And though he didn't say it out loud, he felt his own pride unraveling, because he realized the story wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't about the bet. It was about her. One night he approached her outside the armory again. There was propped against the wall beside her, though she hadn't touched it since that day. "You know," he said, "you've changed things." She arched a brow. "Changed what?" "The way they see you, the way they see what's possible, hell, the way I see things." Her eyes softened, though her voice stayed even. "I didn't set out to change anything." "Doesn't matter, you did." For the first time, silence stretched between them without tension. Not the silence of mockery, not the silence of burden, just quiet understanding. And in that silence, Daniels realized something else. He no longer saw her as the armory clerk. He saw her as a soldier who had shown him a truth he'd forgotten. That humility could stand taller than bravado. That patience could ring louder than pride. The legend grew beyond the base. Reports reached other installations, whispered across units, carried overseas. Some versions were barely recognizable. In one telling, she had fired only one round and hit on the first try. In another, she had humiliated Daniels in front of the entire brigade. She never corrected them. She never claimed them. She let them run, wild and untamed, because deep inside she knew the truth. The shot had never been about proving others wrong. It had been about refusing to let them draw the limits of who she was. And in the quiet of her bunk at night, as whispers of her own name drifted through the barracks, repeated the same words she had told those nervous privates. "Don't let someone else decide what you can't do." It wasn't about rifles anymore. It wasn't about steel plates or distances. It was about dignity, about the courage to rise steady when the world expected you to bend. And though she still feared the weight of the myth, she began to understand something deeper. Sometimes, the burden of being seen was also the gift of reminding others they could be more. The horizon still stretched before her. The steel target still shimmered in the distance, but she no longer needed the clang of impact to know her worth. Silence was enough. What happens when a story stops being just a story and becomes something that lingers long after the voices fade? Months had passed since the bet, but the clang of steel still echoed across Fort. Not in the literal sense. The range was empty most days, its dust carried off by wind, but in the way soldiers spoke, in the way new recruits whispered's name before they even knew the layout of the base. She had refused every request to shoot again. She had declined offers of promotion, transfer, even a formal commendation. She stayed in the armory, sleeves rolled, hands steady, doing the work no one else wanted to do. And still the legend grew. Overseas, in outposts where fear pressed like a second skin, soldiers repeated the story to steady themselves before patrols. She was just an armory clerk, and she hid at 2 miles. It didn't matter that details blurred, that versions contradicted. What mattered was the truth beneath it, that patience could silence doubt, that someone underestimated had refused to bend. Never asked to carry that weight, but she learned to live with it. Daniels, too, had changed. The man who once smirked and mocked now walked with quieter steps. He trained his men the same, but his voice carried a different edge, less arrogance, more steadiness. And when young snipers cracked under pressure, he told them something he never would have months before. "Don't force it. Listen. The shot's a conversation." He never admitted where the words came from, but he knew. One late autumn evening, the air cool and crisp, stood again at the pit. She carried no rifle, only a canteen and her father's notebook tucked into her pocket. The steel target shimmered faintly against the fatting sun. Daniels approached quietly, boots crunching gravel. For a while they just stood together, watching the horizon. Finally he broke the silence. "They're still telling it, you know, overseas, at training camps, even at sniper school, your name's everywhere." Lips twitched faintly, not a smile, not quite. "It isn't my name anymore, it's just a story." "Maybe," Daniels tilted his head, studying her, "but stories matter, especially the ones nobody expects." She looked down at the dirt, the faint tracks of her boots etched beside his. "It doesn't feel like mine anymore." "Doesn't have to," he said softly. "It's bigger than you now, and that's not a curse, Tors, that's a gift. You gave them something to believe in, something to carry when nothing else does." For a long moment, the only sound was the breeze tugging at their uniforms. Then Daniels shifted, his voice lower, steadier. "You know," he said, "I owe you something." Her brow furrowed. "What?" He turned toward her fully now, and in his eyes was no smirk, no bravado, only sincerity. "Respect. I didn't give it when you earned it. I mocked you because it was easier than admitting I was wrong. But you carried it, better than I could have." Held his gaze steady, silent. And then slowly Daniels raised his hand. Not in jest, not in mockery, a sharp, deliberate salute. For the first time since the bet, silence broke her calm. Her chest tightened, breath catching as she realized what it meant. He was a sniper, a leader, a man the base respected. And yet here he was, saluting her, an armory clerk who had never sought the spotlight, who had never asked for anything but to be left to her rifles and silence. She returned the salute quietly, no theatrics, no words, just a brief acknowledgement. Daniels lowered his hand. "Sometimes," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "the ones who never chase it are the ones who deserve it most." The horizon stretched before them, steel barely visible in the fading light, but neither needed to hear its clang again. Because what mattered had already been proven. In the weeks that followed, carried on as before, rifles cleaned, paperwork filed, a quiet figure among the noise of a restless base, but everywhere she went, nods followed her. Not whispers now, not the buzzing of a legend growing wild, but quieter, steadier acknowledgments. Respect. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, it didn't fill parades or ceremonies. But it was there in the way soldiers met her eyes, in the way young privates steadied their breath before, repeating her advice in silence. And Daniels, too, changed in ways few noticed. His training shifted, his tone softened, and when soldiers asked him about the shot, he only said one thing. She listened. The clang of steel had faded into memory, but its echo lived on, not in the distance, not in the myth, but in the quiet resilience of the one who had made it. Because the story was never really about distance, or rifles, or targets. It was about dignity, about silence carrying further than laughter, about one soldier who had no rank, no fame, no hunger for glory, and yet proved that sometimes the greatest strength isn't in speaking but in listening. And when history forgot the details, when rumors blurred and voices twisted the tale into something unrecognizable, one truth remained. She was only in the armory until a sniper bet she couldn't. And she did. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.